Good evening, everyone. I'm Shubham Avasti and I work as Monitoring and Evaluation Lead with Niti Aayog. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all.
Shubham, we can't hear you. Shubham,
Yes, sir.
we can't hear you. Okay, now we can.
Shubham, we cannot hear you. I think there's a problem. We've logged in from a couple of sites.
Sorry, am I audible now?
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much. Apology. So start off with, I'm Shubham. I work as
We're missing your gains, Shubham. Sorry.
please unmute me, guys. Please unmute me. Thank you. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all for the inaugural session of the DMEO leading monitoring and evaluation experts from the
You're not audible, I think.
Yes, sir. I believe there's some technical issues that are. Just give 1 minute and we will be reconnecting. Am I good to go? Good evening, everyone. So sorry to keep you on wait. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all for the inaugural session of the DMU Conversation Series, a platform that is aimed to bringing together leading monitoring and evaluation practitioners. I'm again on mute. Leading monitoring and evaluation practitioners from international development organizations, academia, think tanks, NGOs. To start off with, I would like to invite Dr. Shekhar Bonu, Director General DMEO, to present his opening remarks, please.
Thanks, Shubham. I hope everyone can hear me. Can anyone confirm that you are hearing me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, you are audible. Thank
Okay,
you.
excellent. Okay, good. So, good evening, everyone. Thanks, Shubham. Sorry for the technical glitch. This is the first of our series of DMEO conversation series. Uh, I request everyone to be on mute, and especially if someone is using two instruments in the same room, it leads to echo. So please only use one equipment, and also please be on mute. Uh, DMEO, the Development Monitoring Evaluation Office, is the apex monitoring and evaluation organization in the country. It is an attached office of Niti Aayog.
Can I speak?
The mission of DMEO is to ensure sustainable outcomes and impacts of
Yes,
the government programs. And the way we intend, or the DMEO intend to execute its vision, is by building a very strong monitoring and evaluation ecosystem in this country. It's at the national level, also at the district level. And clearly, it's a massive exercise, and it can't be done by a single organization.
Yes, sir.
Strategy to ensure a strong monitoring evaluation ecosystem across the country, synergic partnerships with international cutting edge monitoring and evaluation organizations, think tanks, academia at the national level, and also with state training institutions. Uh, Anyone who can strengthen this ecosystem in this country. And the whole objective is to play this important role of knowledge intermediation, so that the capabilities for monitoring and evaluation are built strongly in the public sector, and through greater cooperation and synergy among the partners, help greater exchange of knowledge between public sector as well as uh, non-public sector, the world outside, so that knowledge exchange can lead to better insights, better toolkits, faster absorption of the rapidly changing technology into the public sector. So, as a part of this larger vision, DMEO has been experimenting many initiatives, out of which DMEO Conversation Series, whose first conversation is going to be held today, is a sort of an open platform where our esteemed partners would come and present their experiences on in some of the cutting edge monitoring and evaluation work. And on the other side, it's an open platform. Officials from the government, from government of India, state government, training institutions, and others would come in. As we expect that this conversation series would lead to exchange of knowledge, faster dissemination of new practices, and in doing so, strengthen the capabilities in the public sector to do much better job of monitoring and evaluation, which in turn would lead to greater impact of public expenditure on delivering better outcomes and impacts for the citizen of this nation. So I'm very pleased to welcome our esteemed partner, World Food Program, to share their knowledge of analysis of food and nutrition sector during COVID-19. And it's my, I take great pleasure in welcoming Eric, Deputy Country Director, World Food Program, as well as Dr. Divya Tiwari, Deputy Head Evidence and Results at the World Food Program India. With this, I once again ask Shubham to take over and lead the discussion. Shubham.
Thank you so much, sir. Before moving further, I would like to run everyone through the basic ground rules. We'll start by introducing our today's speakers from WFP, and it will be followed by a presentation. We'll keep the audience questions towards the end of the presentations. By default, everyone is requested to be muted for the session. So please type in the questions and we'll answer them towards the end of the session. Yes. Having said that, the session is time bound, and while we'll try our best to address all your questions, if your question still remains unanswered, please write to us. All right then. Let's move to the introduction of the participants. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today Mr. Eric Kenefik, Dr. Divya Tiwari, and Mr. Himanshu from the WFP team. As DG sir indicated, Eric is the Deputy Country Director of the World Food Program in India. Prior to his current appointment, Eric was working at the WFP's Afghanistan and Sudan offices. I'm on mute, yes. This is the conference. Sure. Mr. Eric Kenefik is the Deputy Country Director of the World Food Program in India. Prior to his current appointment, Eric was working at the WFP's Afghanistan and Sudan offices. His work in both the country offices involved leadership and design of strategic programs to address the food and nutritional needs of vulnerable households and individuals. His journey with WFP started in 1998, and since then he has been involved in multiple vulnerability analysis and mapping and M&E studies. Our second speaker, Dr. Divya, she is the Deputy Head of Evidence and Results Unit at the WFP India Country Office, where she is responsible for planning, managing, and executing M&E activities for the WFP projects which are aiming to achieve the SDG 2 targets in the country. A doctorate in population studies with 12 years of experience of working in India and the United Kingdom, she is an outstanding researcher and has been honored with prestigious awards and fellowships from reputed organizations such as Parks Foundation, Cambridge, UK, Population Association of America, IAPPD, India, etc. She has authored several research papers and reports on food security, health, nutrition, and fortification. And finally, our last speaker is Mr. Himanshu Bal, who is the head of WFP Field Office in Odisha. A postgraduate in both business management and rural development, Mr. Bal has extensive experience in the areas of food security, nutrition, social protection, and rural development. Without any further delay, I would next hand over the platform to WFP team. Eric, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. The presentation will be mostly done by Divya with some inputs from me in the middle and towards the end. And Divya, I think I'll hand it to you to kind of guide us through it. I know I'll give a bit of background that Himanshu was the one taking the lead and getting this going with a group, with an interagency group. And then we entered the picture a bit later in the game, and we'll explain a bit more about that in the presentation. So I'll hand it to Divya, and then we'll present together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I hope I'm audible.
But
yes, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the confirmation. So now we will go through the detailed finding of this study. Rationale for conducting this study is that the COVID-19 pandemic could almost double the number of people suffering from acute hunger. So this is based on the WFP estimates, which was published in 2020 Global Report on Food Crisis. Global evidence indicate that vulnerable people without access to running water, laborers, migrants, they are more likely to suffer from the COVID-19 crisis. Thus, in order to understand the situation of food and nutrition security among the vulnerables, such as small marginal farmers, landless, daily wage laborers, and migrant laborers during the COVID-19 period, WFP, Interagency Group, and other partners, they commissioned this study. The objectives of the study were to assess the impact of COVID-19 on food and nutrition security of vulnerable people, such as small marginal farmers, daily wage earners, migrant families in Odisha, accordingly communicating to the government about the seriousness of the problem and providing recommendation. And finally, based on the findings of the study, facilitate in designing short-term and long-term responses for the most vulnerable communities in Odisha. Now, coming to the methods of this assessment, the data has been collected from the 14 diverse districts of Odisha, including different livelihood zones, agroclimatic zones, physiographic zones comprising of aspirational districts and different levels of tribal concentrate, low, moderate, and high. Data has been collected from the vulnerables, who are small marginal farmers, landless daily wage laborers, and migrant laborers, through the volunteers, either telephonically or through maintaining social distancing norms. Data has been collected at the household level. Household tool captured household profile, food consumption pattern, coping strategies adopted in case of food shortages in the household, support received from the government and the non-government organization, and their future requirements, immediate as well as the long-term requirements. This slide discusses in detail the characteristics of the sample districts. So here you can see that the districts, they were taken from all the 3 divisions of the Odisha, central, northern, as well as southern, comprising of aspirational district, tribal concentrate, and diverse physiographic zones, as well as the agroclimatic zones. Coming to the background characteristics of the household, 1/4 of the households were headed by women, while around half of the respondents were in the young age group of 25 to 44 years of age. In order to maintain the gender parity, almost half of the respondents were female. Regarding the presence of vulnerable person in the household, 38% of the households had elderly persons, 11% had disabled person, and 22% had chronically ill person, such as cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc. Here, I would like to hand it over to Eric for discussing on the food security.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay,
Divya,
so
sorry, Adi, Divya, we just had one request. Can you please zoom full screen the presentation, please?
yeah,
Thank you.
because I think it's in review mode and not for full screen. Full screen, yeah, that one maybe. Try the Zoom and see how that goes.
Can you try the display settings at the top?
It's saying drop down display settings. Yeah, I don't know why. There's display settings at the top. There you go. And then look at the screen at the bottom corner. The little cursor or the little icon of the screen on the bottom right. Just down at the bottom where you have the size change. There we go. Awesome. Thanks so much. As many of you may or may not know, WFP's main role in the UN system is on improving access to food, trying to do our best to help alleviate malnutrition through a variety of different activities. And also we work with smallholder farmers and supporting food systems. So we've been in the, let's say, the humanitarian food assistance game for a long time, very long time. And so one of these things that we do look at is dietary diversity and food frequency, as well as where people are sourcing their food, because the reliance on food sources helps you understand the impact of a specific shock on the household's ability to access enough food. So that's one reason that we like to look at food sources. If you're thinking about this population and we're looking at COVID, the impacts of COVID was the lockdown, which resulted in people not being able to move around a whole lot. So they had to, if they were used to buying from the market was having supply issues, and also the people were having access issues, both physically and also because of financial situations has changed. So just to kind of give you a quick snapshot of the main source of food for the sample households, if you see on the y-axis, you see the type of district, region, and head of household. So we're looking at the three regions of central, northern, southern, districts, aspirational versus non-aspirational, and then a head of household, male household, and female household. So just to kind of get an idea which ones are faring better and which ones are having a more of a challenge. So one thing to see here is that as a snapshot, you can see that people rely mostly on their own production of food and also purchase from the market. But then you see differences that the purchase from the market is maybe higher is in the households in the northern region of the sample, and a bit more in the female-headed households who tend to be less working in the livelihoods. I can't manage to see very clearly the bottom, but in the turquoise color, you can see whatever that source is would be maybe a food assistance, that they're relying more on that source of food. Thanks, Divya. And female heads were slightly more vulnerable than those from the other types of households. And you can see that it's not huge, but it could be significant that they tend to suffer a bit more in these cases. And it's not very surprising. The reason for the shortage of food, as we would guess also, is lack of resources, lack of money, inability to access the market due to lockdown. And probably there was a lack of transport if they were not living very close to the markets, and that was also causing problems. Next. Changes in prices of food. You can see also we have a division district comparisons here. The price, I think the option was whether it had increased, which is the red, and then the green would be remain the same, and then the yellow was decreased, because I can't see the bottom of this, that the areas where the prices tended to increase the most during the recall period were in the southern region and the aspirational districts. This was done in April, Prabir. I think it was April. It was in the early parts of the lockdown. So it was fresh in those days. So you can see it was full on at the time, and that it did have quite a quick impact on the ability of households to access food. And we're looking at food consumption. We used a module that is used in WFP globally for our work. And it's this is looking at a 24-hour recall with this data here. So we're looking at what they ate in the past 24 hours and comparing between aspirational and non-aspirational districts. So households in aspirational districts, it's interesting when you're looking at quality of diet a little bit. You kind of have to look at it in several ways. By looking at quality, that we're always told that you shouldn't have too much oil, too much fat. Yes, it's high in calories, but it's not necessarily the best for your health. So when you're considering poorer households or those in aspirational districts, when you compare to the other ones, the non-aspirational, they actually consumed more regularly, were more likely to consume fats and oils than the others. But then for the foods that are maybe better for you, except for sugar, fruits, meat, and dairy, they were less likely to go back, please. You're less likely to consume those foods than at non-aspirational, and they're just slightly less likely to consume vegetables and pulses. So the access to food, the dietary habits, a lot of it could be impacted by COVID. These could exist before COVID, but maybe be compounded as a result of COVID because of their ability to manage the crisis. Okay, thanks, Divya. Next one. So now looking at the same information by sex of household head. As you would expect, the houses where they have a man heading tend to have better access to food and would have better consumption compared to those headed by women. And in the main areas, you can see at the bottom, dairy, meat, and fruits. Women-headed households were much less likely to eat those foods than male-headed households. Of course, we're not factoring in vegetarian, but you assume if you use a randomized sample that it's going to show that. And yeah, Kriti, I don't know exactly on it, but we did some p-tests of significance, but this is just more or less getting a picture of what's going on. So I think we can look at tests of significance in the report and find out more if the difference was actually significant statistically or not. But this is more of a descriptive way of looking at this, but it's a good question. Also, sugars and sweets for some reason, if you're wealthier, you have more sweets maybe in these communities. So anyway, this was just another one of comparing male and female-headed households. Next slide, please. And now we're looking at the dietary diversity at, we clustered them is because of, it was like, you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, I can't see the bottom again, I think 4 categories of numbers of different foods consumed in the past 24 hours. So if you see the darker colors, the red and orange, that's fewer foods, which is also can be a slight proxy indicator for household food security. We can go deeper into it if we were using a tool that we had designed directly ourselves, which we will later. But it does kind of give an indication, again, that households in the southern and aspirational districts and also female-headed households didn't enjoy as much dietary diversity as those in the other groups. So we can say that looking at this sample, that they were suffering a bit more than the other groups due to the lockdown or other aspects of the COVID crisis. Thanks. Next. Yeah. Okay, now back to you, Divya.
As per the WFP documents and manuals on the analysis and interpretation of the coping strategies, food insecure households typically employ 4 types of consumption coping strategies. So first is they change the diet, such as switching from preferred food items to the cheaper or less preferred food items. Second one is they increase the food supplies using short-term strategies such as borrowing or purchasing on credit. Third strategy is that they reduce the number of people in the household by sending a member elsewhere, such as like to a neighbor when they're consuming their food. Fourth type of consumption strategy is attempt to manage the shortfall by rationing the food available to the household. In terms of understanding the severity of the household, a household who is not eating for the entire day is evidently more food insecure as compared to the one who has simply switched consumption to a less preferred option. So in this assessment, respondents, they were asked whether in the past 7 days their households did not have enough food or money to buy food, and what did they do to cope up with this situation. The most frequently used coping strategy was relying on less preferred or less expensive food items. And the least used coping mechanism were restricting the consumption by adults, borrowing the food, or relying on help from a friend or relative. It is extremely worrisome that 40%, 2 in 5 households reduce the number of meals eaten in a day. This graph clearly depicts that aspirational districts, they are more likely to rely on the extreme form of coping strategy, which is reducing the number of meals eaten in a day. Whereas the non-aspirational districts, they are more likely to rely on other forms of coping mechanisms. Coping strategy by sex of the head of the household, female-headed households are more likely to rely on all forms of coping strategies. We conducted the significant test, and we found that female-headed households, they are significantly more likely to rely on all forms of coping mechanisms as compared to their counterparts, that is male-headed households. Further analysis was conducted to assess the number of characteristics. So the greater the number of coping strategies adopted by a household, higher the level of food insecurity in that household. As expected, households in aspirational districts and female-headed households were using more coping strategies, which is reflective of higher level of food insecurity or stress. Eric, over to you. Please share some examples based on your global extensive experience.
I was responding to Kriti's question. Can you mute your mics, please? I was responding to Kriti's question. What was it that you asked me, Divya?
The aspirational and non-aspirational based on your experience in Zimbabwe and in other countries, if you would like to.
Yeah, okay. So that was the point I put in there. It's funny that when you start looking at coping strategies, if you're familiar with the whole concept, I mean, there's a CSI or Coping Strategies Index, which was developed by CARE International, gosh, 25, 30 years ago, maybe 20 to 25 years ago, which collects different coping strategies and has communities weight them in order of severity. So then you can create an index out of it. So it does measure how households respond to stress by changing their dietary consumption, by selling assets, by migration, or sending children out to eat at a relative's house. So there are a lot of different things. But the funny thing is that it's very good for looking at impacts of an acute crisis. But if you're talking about, or if you're looking or measuring or researching communities that are in chronic crisis mode, it doesn't seem to have the same level of sensitivity. And this just from my own experience, because I was working in Southern Africa regional office for 6 years during the worst of the Southern Africa food crisis that morphed into the Zimbabwe's first economic crisis, where they devalued their currency. They're adding 6 to 8 9 zeros on their currency every few months, and it basically was useless. And seeing that how the CSI compared to other countries in the region that weren't experiencing that, the coping strategies were so low because at the end of the day, they have no assets to sell. They're already eating one meal a day. They're already eating foods that are less preferred. They're basically already at the end of their rope. And so this is not a sensitive indicator. So sometimes in really dire circumstances, you will see the coping strategies not being utilized by the most vulnerable groups because they have nothing to change in their habits. And then, surprisingly enough, when I moved to Sudan, and we were doing the same, collecting the same type of information and looking at IDPs, which are internally displaced persons in camps in Darfur, we felt that we saw the same thing, that their coping strategy use was quite low and limited because they didn't have anything to really change. They were living on the basics of existence, even though they were receiving some food assistance, but they didn't have assets and everything like that to be able to manage a crisis because they were in constant crisis. So when you look at the aspirational, you see that their sensitivity to the crisis is a little bit lower because you see a lot more. In fact, compared to the other groups, it's all in green. If we didn't mess up the graph, but the fact is they don't have a whole lot they can do to cope, or maybe actually in this case we didn't look into it, that they didn't feel the impact of COVID the same way that other groups did. So as you'll find out, we're going to do a second round of survey as request of the government. So we're going to note this and take it and look at it a little bit deeper. So, okay, back to you. Sorry, Divya. Thanks.
Okay. So we also conducted the analysis to examine the relation between consumption of food groups and coping strategy. As expected, with the increase in the number of food groups consumed in the last 24 hours, the number of coping strategies used in the last 7 days decreases. Households in which members have less dietary diversity, that is, they have consumed 1 to 2 groups, they are most vulnerable. So they have used the highest number of coping strategies to cope up with this situation of food shortage. We also examined the effect on intra-household food consumption. Within the lockdown, almost half of the households reported change in the amount of food consumed by individual household members. As expected, this was common among members in the female-headed households. Overall, in around 2/3 of the households, adult men and women reduced their consumption as compared to children and elderly. In female-headed households, women and girls in all age groups were more likely to have changed their consumption compared to boys or men in the female-headed household. So this clearly reflects the vulnerability of all female members residing in the female-headed households. Since COVID-19, almost half of the households had borrowed money to meet with the shortage of food. and their family food needs. Almost 2/3 of the households in the central zone borrowed, which is much higher than the northern and the southern zone. When asked about the source of borrowing, most households borrowed money from the neighbors and relatives, followed by local money lenders and saving groups. You can see that only 4% of the households they borrowed money from MFI or bank. In this assessment, we also examined and investigated about households selling or mortgaging of assets to meet their family food needs. Few households, just 6%, reported of selling or mortgaging any household asset to meet their family food needs. But this noted that 10%, 1 in 10 female households, had to sell or mortgage assets as compared to only 1 in 20 male-headed households. Among those households who sold or mortgaged their assets, the most reported assets were cooking utensils, jewelry, or ornaments. 1/10 mentioned about the land. So please think of a farmer selling his land to meet his family immediate food requirements. Households were asked if they had received any support from NGO or government as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. 4 out of 5 households had received the support, with a higher percentage of female-headed households and households from the aspirational districts reported of receiving support. Among those who have received support, majority received support from the government. Households, they were also investigated about the type of support which they have received from the government. So this graph clearly shows that 87% received financial assistance from the government, 65% received PDS, which is also a very huge amount, and other forms of assistance were information.
Divya, we are losing you a bit, Divya. Can you please come closer to the mic, please?
Sure. Is it better now?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Other forms of assistance which the households reported of receiving were information related to raising the awareness about the COVID and others. And a few households reported about hygiene supplies and agriculture and livestock inputs in the form of assistance from the government side. In order to examine the type of support received from the government by the various background characteristics, additional analysis was performed. Female-headed households are most often receive support under the schemes such as widow pension, old age pension, mamta, etc. In addition, a higher proportion of households in the aspirational district, they received support in the form of food, money, NTM, dry HCM. HCM is hot cooked meal, and 3 months of emergency supply. Now we will present households' concerns, immediate needs, long-term needs, and preferred mode of assistance. Respondents, they were asked about their main concern. Households were mainly worried about the shortage of food, lack of work, or the disruption of livelihoods. Households' immediate needs mostly include food support and money. Other moderate needs were hygiene supplies and access to health services or medicines. Households from the aspirational district were more likely to name food and money as their immediate needs, while female-headed households were more likely to mention hygiene supplies as their immediate needs compared to the households. They were also asked about their long-term needs over the next 1 month. As with their immediate needs, foods and money are the most often reported needs by nearly 4 out of every 5 households. Just over 40% of the households reported the need for hygiene supplies, while 35% reported needing access to health services and medicine. 1 in 10 households, they reported the need for agriculture or livestock inputs. Households, they were also inquired about the preferred mode of assistance. It is to be noted that cash and food were the most preferred form of assistance, with vouchers being the least preferred mode. Female-headed households were more likely to request food and materials as compared to the male-headed households. Now, over to you, Eric, for discussing the recommendations based on this study.
Thank you. I can just say it also, if you notice a little bit on the mode of assistance preferred, that if you notice that the non-aspirational were more happy to get cash, whereas in aspirational districts, you can see that food was their top choice. So you can also see some differences like that. Female households inversely wanted cash over food. With male-headed households, it was food over cash, along with materials. So you can see quite a few differences there. Okay, so we go back to the recommendations. And again, this report, like I said, just to give a bit of background, Himanshu and the team in Odisha did the design, the data collection, and started building a database, but then they kind of got stuck on the analysis side of it. So I volunteered the country office to step in and help the group take over. So I worked with Divya on getting the database ready to analyze. And then we focused on food security and nutrition because it was more of our area of expertise. There was a bit of a broader scope of the survey, and Himanshu can explain it. So that's why it's a bit fragmented, and why we don't necessarily have answers to all of your questions, because at the end of the day, I didn't even see the questionnaire until I was cleaning up the data set. So I would have done things differently, and we will do it differently. So yes, there are some gaps in understanding the complete flow of information and answering a lot of the questions, but we'll do our best. So if you're looking at it, just some recommendations upon what we have here, that there is an issue with food consumption and dietary diversity. And as we all know, probably a lot of it is due to existing socioeconomic issues that have been exacerbated through the COVID crisis, one way or another, with decreased income, lack of mobility, access to markets, and so forth. So it did affect how people were living in those early days of the lockdown. And that's one thing that also comes out of it is, the government did a good job expanding the TPDS coverage, the entitlements, and it's still doing that in order to try to meet increased needs of the people. But people still didn't feel like it was always enough. And so this is one reason the government wants a second round, to see how they were performing, which I think is a great idea, because if you're running such a huge program, you do want to look, are you actually having an impact? Are you making a difference? Also, what's interesting for me as a practitioner in this field is their dependency and reliance, because there will be households that will just take their entitlement and it's not a big deal. But then you realize there are quite a few households that really, really need this entitlement from the different social safety net programs the government has. So the government did a good job, but it seems like it could have, in hindsight, more would help. Cash assistance was interesting. There's a possibility, and it is a good practice in other countries to use more in cash, because it also helps with the supply chain in the economics. You have supply and demand. Also, if you give cash, people have the dignity to buy food or whatever to meet their needs, because you saw that people needed, especially women, needed hygiene supplies. You need more than just food. So cash allows more flexibility in doing an emergency response, rather than just giving bags of food all the time. But you have to weigh it out carefully and make sure you're trying to do the best thing. Sometimes even a combination works. Distribution of assistance, as we said for the second one, the TPDS should be expanded, and it was. And I think we're going to help the government look at that, especially with the inclusion of pulses. What did it do? What did it take? What would it be like to be continual? And then, of course, Niti's basically running the whole, thinking around aspirational districts, that, your vulnerable groups really still are the households in aspirational districts and those headed by women. And this is, now we have evidence to show it. And in the second round, we will also try to look and see if indeed this comes up twice in a row, then yeah, we have data. So I think that's really good. So these were the short-term solutions. And now we're trying to help the government look at what are the long-term solutions, the economic recovery. Where are your entry points? Is it at Minrega? Is it at more types of systems that deliver inputs, or just beefing up the procurement of food from the smallholder producers, women's self-help groups, you name it? There are a lot of entry points to look at livelihood assistance and the socioeconomic recovery. So this is the end of this presentation, and I see there are quite a few questions that have been coming up in this last bit. So over to Subham.
Thank you so much, Eric and Team WFP, for the excellent presentation. That was really insightful. We'll next move to the questions. So the first question came in from Prabir. So he asks, was the sample representative district-wise or as state as a whole? So Divya, would you like to please take the question?
Representative at the state level.
Okay, so, okay.
It wasn't representative at the state level. Himanshu, why don't you explain it? Sorry, Divya. But it was a purposive sample from what I understand. Himanshu.
Yeah, as and the methodology that was adopted for this survey, which took place immediately after the lockdown version 1.0 was introduced in the country, it mainly went by the 2011 census, which was the basis, and from these the PSUs were defined, and from each PSU, basing on on the PPS methodology, the households were identified, and it was mainly between 30 to 40 households were taken from each of the districts. And the higher the district, the larger was the sample size.
So it was basically sampled to be able to compare across different groups.
Yeah.
So you can look, because when you're talking about representative, you're talking about coming up with a single percentage that represents either a state or a district, and that was not the case here. One thing since this is kind of a learning environment, when you're doing something like a vulnerability analysis, there are different things you have outcomes on. This one was looking more at prioritization of different types of socioeconomic groups, not to try to come up with some big figure saying these number of people in the whole state or these number of people here are this way or another. So you basically, your sampling is done a little bit differently, not to come up with a final figure, but to come up with understanding of how something like a crisis of COVID and the resulting lockdown is going to impact different groups of people. And so it's comparison across groups without having a representative sample. I'm happy to talk about that in another session if you want to discuss sampling. I have very strong views on it. So over to you.
Thank you, Eric. So there are two related questions I think that I would like to take now. So the next question was asked by Tanvi. She asked us whether caste as a factor was also taken into consideration during the sample selection, and she reasons that since at a village level the localities are also divided based upon the caste. So was it considered? That's the first one. And the related sampling question was, how was the distribution ensured? So as we can see from the finding, half of the respondents were female respondents. So how the team ensured that?
Okay, no, caste was not taken as a consideration in the survey. And on the second aspect is how, because this survey was conducted by the IAG members in the state of Odisha, and mostly it was done by the local NGOs. And when it was either conducted through mobile phone or in person, maintaining the social distancing norms. And most of the times, the districts where the districts involved in the study were from the tribal districts or the districts prone to migration. And so many of the households, they were deprived of their male counterparts as they were away, because it was done, the study was conducted during the initial phase of lockdown. By the time the migrant people were outside, they had not returned. And in other cases, it was what I could understand from the members who undertook this study, that they prefer to interact more with, since it was phone based and this thing. wanted to interact more with the women members in the households they interview.
Can I just speak up on that as well? I think there was a misunderstanding. It wasn't 50-50 male-headed female, 50% female-headed household, 50% male-headed households. That was not the case. I think it was quite skewed, like 75-25 in there. And again, when you're looking at a needs as a rapid survey to understand the situation on the ground, building huge lists, doing all of the, this type of, if you see how long it takes to do a survey in India, following all the government recommendations, you would take 2 years to complete something like this, which isn't feasible when you're trying to give quick responses back to the government. So you look at what your needs are information-wise, and then you make decisions on how to use the information with the restricted conditions. And I think one thing you should really look at is doing phone data collection because of COVID and because of lack of movement. So you have to remember the circumstances. This is not something you're going to do a PhD thesis on. It's something you're going to look at how do you manage a multi-sector, multi-partner rapid assessment in the middle of a crisis to find out some information to give back to the government to see how things are going with the people that are the constituents. So you do your best job to randomize, you do your best job to get coverage. You purposely select areas that you can say you can, maybe it could be of course improved, but then you can extrapolate findings to other similar groups. So that's why you look at a sample with an aspirational sample within female, but that was only on the stratification of the analysis, not of the design side. So you knew that the design was to get some heavily populated tribal area or some districts that had a higher percentage of tribals, and also districts that were aspirational. And that was the purposive side. And the rest was where we stratified on the analysis. Over.
Thank you, Eric. So we do still have time. So Harshila asked that question. Her question is more related to analysis. So she asked, what measures were taken to analyze the quantity and quality sufficiency of the food? So can the team provide insights into why more vulnerabilities were found in female-headed households?
I'll look at that again too. You're going to get tired of me speaking. I think, again, we didn't have if I can say it nicely, it was a really messy data set. So we had to make the best out of it. There were good intentions, but it wasn't well organized. I think as I said, we use a 24-hour recall. So you stick with 8 different food groups. And you look at dietary diversity, you're not looking at necessarily nutritional adequacy, because that goes into a different realm. I've looked at an individual dietary intake and then trying to measure that against the age and the sex of individual members of the household. But if you're looking at proxy indicators of household food security, and which includes dietary adequacy, you look at diversity and frequency over a 7-day recall period. So when you have more diversity in a diet, I think the research will show you that means that the household has better access to food and a variety of foods, have more resources, and can afford to eat different types of food over a 7-day period or even in a 24-hour recall. So it's a proxy indicator of, let's say, doing okay with food access. When you're looking at the other side, it goes into a completely realm on an individual dietary intake and nutrition, and not necessarily. So you have to just say, okay, they're managing, and again, this is a crisis. This is not business as usual. So that's why some of these indicators seem strange to you, because they're not research indicators from looking at a static situation, but it's looking at a dynamic situation and looking how people's dietary consumption will change due to a shock. And that's kind of what I got involved in doing 20 years ago in WFP. And it's super fascinating to look at how normal household business changes completely when you have a shock that affects everybody. And this was a shock that affects everybody in some way or another, rather than what they call idiosyncratic shocks, which has a different type of impact. So yeah, there's more room for improvement for sure, but that wasn't the main focus. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. The next question is from Ms. Mosumi from NCAER. She asks, is poor access to markets, rural vegetable producers, and taste possible reasons for high consumptions of fats and sugars as compared to vegetables and pulses for the aspirational districts? Is there a lack of home gardening in the household? And who is responsible for nudging people to consume more of protein-rich food items?
Very good. Himanshu, this is your state. Do you want to speak something about this, please? Himanshu, are you on mute? There you are. Yeah, I see you. Okay.
Himanshu, you would have to unmute yourself.
Just tap it once. It stays with the line through it, but it goes black, and then it means you're not muted.
I think he's having some issues in his
Okay.
mic.
I think
Divya,
it's part of the leaders in the aspirational district. From what I understand, when we had a presentation by your colleague from Niti Aayog at the UNCT, he said his nickname is Mr. Aspirational District, but I forgot his real name. He said that you have like leadership within the district that should be monitoring the different activities going on. I think it would be great to have more work done to look at social behavior change communication amongst low-income households and households in aspirational districts, to talk to them more about better dietary consumption. And you're right, fresh fruits and vegetables would be great. But again, as I see Urvashi's coming in, also if they're relying on the TPDS, all they're getting is cereals from the government. So they have to complement that with their own resources to get the fresh fruits and vegetables, which I think would improve the diet. And the fat intake, I think, just might be a cultural thing too. We don't know. So that was the surprising part for me, is that I'd normally expect fat intake in maybe higher in poor urban households rather than in rural areas. So that's something we will look at in the next round. But good point. Thanks.
thank you, Eric. I believe I'll take one final question. And since you also mentioned about doing in the next round, so one of the participants asked, if the study is to be undertaken in the urban areas, what are the three key major things that the evaluators should consider?
I'm going to dominate this because Himanshu can't get off. We did have, let's say, guidance from the government. Yeah, we want to look at the three major urban poor areas. What we're looking at in this next round is a little bit more focus on livelihoods, because in this phase of the COVID recovery is, how are people coping? How are they going back to work? What has changed when you had the in-migration and now reverse migration is started? So what is going on? How are urban people disproportionately affected? Because one story I always tell is that when I come to Orissa and stay in Bhubaneswar, the hotel we stay at, every morning when we're coming out to go to meetings or to the office, is where the same place where people queue up to be picked up for daily wage work. So you have a huge crowd of people with their hose, with their water bottles, ready to go to do daily work. So the government wants us to look at the daily wage earners, migrants, and then also subsistence farmers more carefully in this next survey. So I think really when you start looking at livelihoods, which was kind of a component missing from the first survey, because you didn't really have a way of classifying households on how they earn their income, just that they seem to be poorer because of A, B, and C. And we're also looking at proxy indicators of household wealth, like asset ownership, and looking at varieties of assets. So I think, what we're going to be looking at there also is that a lot of these people were falling out of the safety net programs of the government for one reason or another. Now that the One Nation, One Ration card has been rolled out in quite a few states, that there's that opportunity to also look at, are these people accessing these entitlements if they're qualified, and if not, what are the barriers to accessing the government's entitlement programs? or what you call social protection or social safety nets? And is it more, is it better or worse for urban versus rural? These are big questions because the government has scarce resources and it needs to know where to allocate its efforts to reach the greatest amount of people in the most efficient manner. So those are some of the areas we're trying to look at in the next round of the assessment. Does that help?
Yes, thank you so much, Eric. Now we will, as we are running short of time, so we'll like to move closer to the end. I would like to thank you, WFP team, and the speakers for collaborating with us and for sharing the insights and the learnings. We'll also like to thank DMEO Conversation team and DMEO senior leadership for the support and guidance. And last but not the least, the audience for bearing with us and participating actively. So if you like the session or maybe did not like anything about it, please be on a lookout for a feedback link that we will be emailing it to you shortly. Please write to us. We'll wait to hear from you to improve further. As we close, I'd like to share that it is our constant aim to share and discuss the emerging practices and research in M&E domain through the DMU Conversation series. Today was the first step, and we'll soon release a notification regarding the next session. So please be on a lookout for the notification on our website and follow our social media pages. Thank you and see you next time.